Well, hello, I'm alone in Finland. This is just some random stuff from back in the day of when I was learning how to play with some big toys. And today I wanted to talk about, and you probably guessed it already from the title, but I wanted to talk little bit about mental health and stuff like this, and just in a sort of abstract way because it's something that I've had to deal with in the past couple of years. I think a lot of us have after ye old, as they say, the once in a lifetime plague that is kind of a weird thing to say when you consider that if you're over 20 years old, you've actually lived through three of these. If you go through the most recent virus, and then back before it, we had swine flu and we had bird flu, which were two global pandemics that people didn't quite sort of understand they were global pandemics and particularly serious. So, with that sort of being said, I was having a conversation today with somebody, and as we were talking about it, I realised that it wasn't just me that was having a particular problem in this area. In literally my physical area where I live, there was a problem with the doctors, and I thought this is actually kind of a good thing because a lot of people didn't sort of recognise, and the person I was talking to was kind of shocked by some of the stuff that I was saying, even though when you actually think about it, it makes perfect sense. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to go through a little bit of some common mental health stuff, more related to me and the whole ADHD thing, but at the same time some knowledge that I think some people don't actively think about, but we all realise it when we think about it. It doesn't come to our mind straight away, especially if you're in a situation where you're in a bit of trouble with stuff. It's comforting to think of the people that are helping you as like all powerful and all knowledgeable. So before I sort of get into the main bit, I want to go through a quick sort of chunks of descriptions of things. Now, I will try and say where this is fact, where this is not fact, it's opinion myself, and where this is something, and this is what I think is particularly important, something that is not known, something that people don't know, or that is sort of theory and not tested and stuff like this, because a lot of people don't realise how much of that is significant. So let me go through I'll start with some descriptions of some different stuff quite quickly. But if you've got any mental health things, I think the most important takeaway from any of this is it comes down to hope. And that sounds really hippie-ish, I'm well aware of that, but in my sort of experience, it's when somebody runs out of hope, when they cannot see a way through, that is a particular problem, and it's trying to find something to make you more positive. Whether that be some of the more severe or some of the less severe sort of mental issues that people can sort of come around, if you can't see a way past it, then that's the problem, and hope is the sort of the life raft that can get you through a lot of it. And sometimes it's just down to trying to sort of compartmentalise stuff and see if there's just a tiny glimmer to keep going. And I think that's important enough that I want to put it right up front. So if you get bored with me talking and stuff like that, I completely understand, but that's something that I think is very paramount, that is something that people sort of underestimate the power of it, but that's what gets people to step back from the ledge, or gets people to think about the day after and things like that. Now, as I said, with the lack of knowledge, there is a severe lack of knowledge, and people don't quite understand where that's sort of coming from. It's just coming from ignorance as a society. I'm not talking about like lack of knowledge of one particular person being stupid. I'm talking about as a society, we don't quite understand this yet. We haven't gotten to that point, and we think that medical research and understanding are further ahead than they are, and when you start looking into it, it kind of gets frightening how far behind we are, or just how unknowledgeable we are in certain areas. There's also a problem with differing definitions, because like for instance, if you're talking about something like complex PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or as it was known originally, shell shock, when it's complex, people don't always understand that. And if you look at the definitions between, for instance, the DSM, the Diagnostic Standard Manual in America, and the WHO documents for the world, the DSM doesn't have complex. They do have things that cover it, but they categorise things differently, and it comes down to sort of a cultural thing. And then there's sort of that sort of links into incomplete research and also compromised research, and I'll get back to that in a bit. But this is something that is particularly important to understand about how some of this stuff has gone together. So first, with a couple of little definitions, I want to go through sort of the ones that I'm looking at sort of more intensely, that I'll talk about a little bit more intensely. So first off, we have ADHD. ADHD is something that is completely misnamed. The ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. There also used to be a thing called ADD, which is Attention Deficit Disorder, and that's kind of either disappeared or fallen under ADHD as a subcategory. But basically these days ADHD falls into three categories. You've got hyperactive, you've got inattentive, and then you've got combined, my personal blessing. So hyperactive is exactly what you think. People are very active, they are always sort of moving, they have problems sitting still. Inattentive is the kid that dreams out the window and imagines stuff in their head while in class. And then combined, which is your sort of mixed blessing of both. Now I'm going to skip through these quickly, so I'll get back to them in more detail. After that, bipolar disorder. And if you don't sort of know or understand bipolar disorder, essentially you have mood swings from positive to negative that have no sort of push behind them. So there hasn't been something, there is just a mood switch. Now, bipolar disorder is something very important to read up on if you're ADHD, because it is the most commonly misdiagnosed thing for ADHD. There isn't actually any overlap in modern definitions of ADHD between ADHD and bipolar disorder. However, we'll get to this in a bit, but it's something that if your doctor isn't up to date with the latest materials, you might get slammed into that definition of, well, it's not really ADHD, basically because they don't understand it, and they start going for bipolar disorder. But the difference is that if you have sort of mood swings that are caused by something, even if it's a slight thing, that's not really bipolar disorder, that is something causing it. It may be an overreaction to whatever's caused it. But bipolar disorder, which used to be called manic disorder, is it's something where, or manic depressive disorder, sorry, it's something where there isn't a cause to that. Then we have sort of depression. Now, the quick one for depression is, it is essentially a depressive disorder. Depression is known as a depressive disorder. It's a common mental disorder, and it is essentially a depressed mood or a loss of pleasure or interest in activities for a long period of time. Now, where this sort of gets into problems is because when they call it a disorder, some people just are experiencing a shit time in their lives and they're not having anything to look forward to. They have a lot of bad things going on. So it's not a disorder, it's an appropriate reaction. But depending on the doctor, is depending on how it's treated and how it's looked at, because they might just go, well, you're sad and you should be happy. It's like, how should I be happy? I've got relatives dying, I've got no prospects, I've got no money, blah 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 blah. You've got all these reasons for it. That's a correct response. So it's not a disorder in that, it is just being depressed. And it depends very much on your doctor as to how they will treat that. So it's something to be aware of. Then you have anxiety. Now this is one that I didn't actually understand until very recently, because originally I've never sort of understood it or seen it in myself. I probably have had it, but I didn't understand it until more recently, where somebody suggested that this was what was going on, and then when they did tests they were like, well, you actually test very low for this, but there was specific triggers that were actually linked into what we'll talk about next, PTSD, which caused anxiety. So anxiety sort of falls into three types. You have generalized anxiety disorder, where people have issues such as like your health, your money, etc., family and stuff like this, but your worries are excessive for what's going on. You spiral out of control sort of mentally about it and panic about it. Then you've got panic disorder, which is that same worrying and panicking but about nothing, so there is no thing pushing you into that. Then you've got people that actually have phobias, where you have an intense fear of something and that causes that anxiety, but it's a phobia, it's not something that's realistic of things like this. I knew somebody that actually had this that was linked to polystyrene of all things, and until I sort of realised what was going on, we used to torment this guy, poor guy. But there was a particular moment I did a particular joke where I had covered the person in polystyrene while he slept, because it was funny. He woke up, he panicked, he came up, he was gonna beat the living snot out of me, except for I had protection, and from up my sleeve I pulled out a sword, a little polystyrene sword, and he couldn't come anywhere near me, and it probably saved my life, to be honest. But I didn't understand exactly what was going on, that it was a severe phobia, a severe reaction, and I was causing a lot of mental damage there, because I was a young lad and I thought it was funny, and I still think it was funny. Even he thinks it was funny, but still, it can cause some damage, and it's not the best thing to do. So then we have PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, battlefield fatigue, shell shock, all the different names for it. Now PTSD is essentially a response to a negative situation. If you've had something bad happen to you, or if you've witnessed something bad, you may start getting flashbacks, nightmares, severe anxiety, uncontrollable thoughts about the events. You might sort of snap back into those memories without realising it. You might just be sort of doing something else, and something causes you to relive that nightmare. You might be awake, you might be asleep, and it might cause some severe emotional things. You also have avoidance, so trying not to think about it, staying away from places or people that remind you of it, etc. And these can be very severe things that are going on, and it can sort of cause sort of negative thoughts about yourself, and ongoing issues, and then start to cause issues in relationships and things like this, because there is this sort of stress in between you and them and everybody else. And that leads into the next one, which is complex PTSD. Now, complex PTSD is something that, for instance, the DSM, as I've mentioned, doesn't recognise it, but the WHO does. There's various different classifications for things like this. Essentially, to give you the layman's idea about it, because of how they sort of describe it, essentially you've had PTSD from a stressor, from something that's caused it, but then that stressor hasn't gone away, and you have endured that constantly for a sustained period of time, and I think they say it's like 6 months to a year minimum. But the thing is that basically PTSD is like firing you back into your fight or flight response. Well, this is a case of complex PTSD is you have never left that fight or flight response, which is supposed to be a short-term thing in your body, and because of all those different chemicals that your body's producing, it starts to cause damage, and the damage is physical. You can get changes to your brain chemistry. You can actually get scarring that's visible on an MRI depending on what's going on. Now, the reason that I'm sort of talking about this a bit in the abstract, and I'm not particularly going with the definitions of it, is because one of the things, and I'll read this right here from the NHS in Britain, because it says causes of complex PTSD. Complex PTSD may be caused by experiencing recurring or long-term traumatic events, and then the for example says childhood abuse or neglect, domestic violence, sexual abuse, torture, trafficking, slavery, war. And then it may be worse if you experienced it at a young age, or if it was somebody that was close to you that did it, or you couldn't escape the trauma. Now, this is where I sort of veer away from this, because the situation that happened to me, and part of the reason it was particularly difficult, is that it wasn't as severe as that. It was a situation where I was trapped and I could not leave what was going on, and this has actually happened to me more than once for separate reasons, but it wasn't physical violence. And the reason that it's difficult to deal with, like for a medical professional, is because when you talk about my history, there has been violence. There has been a lot of violence. I was raised with ginger hair and glasses in Scotland. If you don't know, between 1982 and 2002, Scotland had the highest index of interpersonal violence of anywhere in the world by 3 times. And if you look at how many genocides and wars happened in that particular 20-year stretch, you'll realise how much worse it was. It wasn't killings, it wasn't murder, it was just instances of violence, but that much more. And that was a general thing, and being young, glasses and red hair, you're a target. So I got a little bit more of a share of it, but it didn't cause me any trauma or PTSD or anything like this. And I describe things as funny stories, and I know other people from Scotland that describe things as funny stories, and then you look around, even people from like England, just across the border, or Wales, Northern Ireland, you will see shocked looks on their faces. But then you go further abroad, you talk to people from America, from Australia, Canada, and various different cultures sort of outside of the English raised world, and you see complete abject horror at something that you're describing that you thought was a funny story and is a funny story to you. And this is something that I'm it's been a bit of a problem, because they're going, have you ever dealt with this? Yeah, it's not a problem. How about this? Yeah, it's not a problem. So this wasn't an issue? No, it wasn't, because it wasn't trapped. It wasn't something where this is going to happen to you. It's not daily abuse. It wasn't this. It would just happen to be that I got involved in fights, or I would step in if somebody else, etc. So that's something that is where I differ on some of the stuff, because a lot of doctors sort of disregard it if it's not so severe. And it's something to be aware of, that we are all different people, and our response to trauma is not always the same. And something that is sort of laughed about is when you see things like, oh, I got PTSD from Twitter. And you see somebody who's a bit of a celebrity, usually a Z-list celebrity, who has sort of talked about how they got trauma from this. But you don't realise that what they're sort of doing, the situation they're in, you will get a lot of people who sort of follow that sort of chavvy nonsense and boring sort of celebrity lifestyle, or lower celebrity lifestyle, that are not particularly nice people, that will go there just to be nasty to people. They will try and sort of troll them, they'll try and be evil, there'll be threats of violence and everything else. And experiencing that daily when you open your phone, constant threats, and then occasionally somebody gets a personal detail that you didn't think was out there, that could be traumatic, because you'd be terrified of that. You don't know what's going on, but you do know about the bad stories and the things that have happened in life. So those things can turn into something particularly severe, and you can get that sort of type of trauma while having some money, while not having a particularly bad life, but having constant threats. So something to sort of be aware of. And then the last thing I want to put in, just to try and lift the mood in general, is a thing called Ehrling syndrome. Now, this is something that I technically have, I was diagnosed with, and it may not exist. It is something that you should look into. It's quite funny. There's a lot of information about Ehrling syndrome out there, but essentially Ehrling syndrome is considered to be how do they say it? It is actually from the Wikipedia page. Ehrling syndrome is not a medical condition. It is a type of visual processing disorder research shows can be mitigated through individualized spectral filtering. In other words, they either give you coloured glasses, or they give you coloured sheets to put over their paper so that you can read faster. Now, I was tested for this when I was at school. However, a lot of the things that they talk about, it overlaps with ADHD, and it overlaps with dyslexia. And the only thing that doesn't really overlap is the photosensitivity. So for instance, if I'm in a room where there are strip lights, because strip lights are sort of, they're not actually kicking out light, they don't energise something that creates visible light, they energise something that creates UV, and then that reacts with the coating on the bulb, which produces light. For some weird reason, that gives me phenomenal headaches, and I actually stopped my career in computing because of this, because I was getting phenomenal headaches, and I thought it was sitting in front of a computer programming and testing every day. And it turns out that years and years later I found out that it was nothing to do with the computers, which didn't make sense anyway, because I could sit down and game for 48 hours. But it turns out that it was actually sat in an office that had strip lights. And after that I sort of moved away from those type of offices, and it wasn't until I was going through the stuff for ADHD that we went back through the stuff for Ehrling syndrome, and I found out that this photosensitivity was one of the things, but it had never been described to me by the doctors for various different reasons. So nowadays they are shunning away from this, because it's one of these syndromes where they basically said, we've got a whole load of people that have all of these symptoms and we've locked them together, and this is our grouping for them. But the sort of groupings are falling apart as they know that other things are going on. So for instance, the coloured sheets, that was something where My reading level, part of the reason it wasn't picked up at a young age is because my reading level was above normal. But when they gave me the coloured sheets, it increased by 25%. So I could read really fast with these coloured sheets, but I wasn't particularly slow without them. And as they went through different tests, this sort of came up as basically I had something going on that was holding me back, but nobody really noticed because holding me back, I was still above average. And nowadays they're going, well, that's not actually a thing, it's these different things. There's a migraine disorder, which I was diagnosed with as a young kid, which can cause the photosensitivity. There's ADHD, which they didn't really know about in Scotland, especially 80s through 90s, and that makes sense when this is where my personal opinion comes in. I think the rate of ADHD in Scotland is far higher than it is anywhere else in the world. Possibly Germany might match it, but when you look at ADHD on the basis of the culture, so for instance, in Japan they have the same instance, they have a lower instance per population, but they have the same diagnosis to non-diagnosis rate. But Japan has had a lot more agrarian, a lot more sort of farmers for a lot longer than Europeans, because they were essentially more civilized further back. And people that live in the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, ADHD is a bonus, not a detraction, because it's very reactive, which is what a hunter-gatherer needs, as opposed to planning, which is what a sort of neurotypical mindset is. But Scotland were warriors for a lot longer than even the rest of Britain, because we were sort of fighting with England. There's a whole load of history there. But even going up into the First World War, Scottish were used as cannon fodder, because the British would lose less Scots in a charge than they would if the battalion was English. So when they were going up and over, they would send the Scots first, because there was a higher sort of survival rate for them. They were known as warriors. And I think that sort of flows through to when you look at my high school. We had a phenomenal amount of class clowns. We had like 6 or 7 per 20 people, and it was sort of a weird thing. You can't really identify ADHD if a quarter of the class is ADHD, as opposed to 1 or 2 kids. So I think this is why it was never really noticed, but also why we had a bit better education, is because the teachers sort of knew what the kids were like, so they were always very engaging and very good. So that's the sort of rough thing about the descriptions of the symptoms. But now I want to talk about the doctors, because this is where some people get tripped up, because you've got a lot of variables in the doctors, and a lot of people, especially if you're in a bit of trauma or you're going through something yourself, you tend to latch onto them as essentially the superheroes that know all, and people forget that they are just people and they are just doing a job. It is no different a job than, say for instance, somebody that works in a hotel, somebody that works in an office, somebody that's an accountant, or somebody that's a priest. These are all jobs, and you might have more or less interest in them. You might be sort of more eager, or you might be less eager, and this sort of comes in with sort of mixed in, because medical science is constantly evolving, and it's evolving faster now than it ever has. So there's a couple of aspects that will sort of define how good your doctor is, and you should always get a second opinion. Even if you don't disagree with the first opinion, you should always get a second opinion, because of your sort of bias of wanting it to be right. So first up for your doctor's things: training. When they were trained and how they were trained, because a general GP is going to have less knowledge of a specific situation than a specialist. But you also might have a specialist that was trained, say for instance, a decade and a half ago, and if they're interested, they might have kept up with their training, they might have looked at the more recent stuff, or, like I've experienced, there might be somebody who got trained in a particular subject and then didn't bother to read any of the new material. If you go back 15 years ago, there was a lot of people sort of within the ADHD community, like the scientific community, that were saying that ADHD just didn't happen in women. So women were diagnosed at a lot lower rate because they thought it was a male-only thing. They didn't know the difference between attentive and inattentive. They didn't sort of see the difference, and this is why now there's an explosion of ADHD being diagnosed for women in their 40s and 50s, because now they're starting to have a whole load of problems, and they're just realising that it's not actually a problem, it's that their brain isn't sort of designed to work the way a neurotypical brain is. so there is adjustments required, but because of the sort of self-doubt and things like this, it's worth being thrown into this sort of mental crisis because I'm not like that other person on social media or stuff like this. So when the doctor was trained and what the doctor was trained for is very important. Even if they are a specialist, they might not have like the right subclass or things like this. So it's always something to be aware of. Then you've got the general attention and the interest in their job, because you might have a doctor who just doesn't like his job, or a particular person, a particular doctor who doesn't like you, so doesn't want to go out of their way to do things. And I've experienced both of those whilst also having the other side of it, where somebody who is so overly eager to be trained. And this is where the sort of age comes back in again, because a younger doctor might be more willing to try new things, to look at more things, or might have fresher knowledge than an older doctor. We normally sort of think of age as experience, but it's not always the way, especially in a field that's evolving as fast as medicine. And again, you might have somebody who's just trained in that job but then has no interest in it, but that's how they make money, so they're not really going to go out there. Then, and this is a particularly American one, but it is in other places in the world, you have conflicts. So for instance, and this has become a big problem specifically with ADHD, is that you have people who are getting kickbacks to prescribe things. So they are more likely to look for something that gets them a bit of money, even subconsciously, if they know I'm going to prescribe this, therefore I'm going to get a kickback from the drug company. That could be a problem, and it has been a problem in ADHD research, because a lot of people that go in, they just take their initial diagnosis from the doctor, but the doctor might have been receiving a kickback, and now you've got this big problem with misdiagnosis of ADHD and over-reported figures. But those people that had diagnoses were going into being tested, so you've got tests done on people that didn't actually have ADHD but were taking stimulants, and so it sort of invalidates a whole load of research, and we just don't know how much. And then you've got sort of the workload, because for instance you could be in an area like mine where they say, oh, it's going to take you 6 months to go through the diagnosis process, and actually it took over 2.5 years because the doctors are so heavily overloaded, especially right now with all of this mental health thing going on. And that's also, you have to sort of keep an eye on these things, and it's particularly difficult if you are in that situation and going through it, because you're just sort of latching on to the hope, to almost a messiah of hope and knowledge, and they might not have that, so it's always worth trying to step back and have a look at what's going on there. Then when we're talking about mental health, one of the most important things is sort of the support networks. You have family, friends, council, maybe local government depending on where you are, healthcare, hospitals, your actual work, the internet, which is particularly dangerous, and then charities. But with all of those, they all sort of have the same sort of problems. One, you might have a bias. For instance, if you're talking about family, your family might have the assumed knowledge. Oh, I know what this is. I've been a nurse. I am the expert in this. And actually they might have no knowledge about it whatsoever, or the knowledge is 50 years out of date, which makes it even worse than nothing. You might have sort of discrimination. Not active discrimination against like colour or things like that, but discrimination because of what their experiences was. Remember, for instance, if you have ADHD, it's most likely one of your parents has it. It's almost, again, this hasn't been proven because they haven't researched it, but the mass sort of consensus is that it looks like it's genetic, so it passes down, so at least one of your parents is going to be ADHD, so they might actually understand what symptoms you're dealing with, but they might just be sort of palming it off because, oh well, you just need to focus. So for instance, if you're talking to a relative that was raised in the 50s, and you have a problem focusing at school, but they got through that fine, kind of missing the fact that their teaching, the way that they got through it was to have a teacher that would shout at them if they mumbled for a split second, that would hit them with a cane or a belt or things like that to reinforce the lesson if they dared speak twice. So they had this sort of instant feedback, which is very good for ADHD, but it was backed up with violence, which is very bad in general for personality, but will reinforce that. So they might have learned how to focus, because an ADHD person can learn how to work as a neurotypical mentally, but it takes practice and time and effort, and they are sort of missing how much time was focused on it because they don't think of the belt, the cane, the constant shouting back at them as being trained out of their ADHD habits. And this can also work if you've got somebody who's manic or somebody who is bipolar, where they've got this situation of, everybody gets those ups and downs for no reason. I've been dealing with that my entire life. Well, yes, you have. And it's a mental disorder, but you don't recognise it as one, and that's the sort of problem. You can also get this sort of falls into the age difference. If you're talking to somebody in their 60s and they're going, oh, well, that was normal when I was a child. Yes, so was slavery and beating your child. It's not normal these days, sort of thing. And you've got that sort of knowledge basis that they've got. Sometimes it might be similar, but sort of through a weirder lens, like for instance what I've just mentioned. Or it could just be that they have knowledge of something that's completely wrong. If you don't understand that, just go back and watch Mythbusters and see how many things that were common knowledge were just nonsense. I cannot tell you how many things on Mythbusters that I had been told as a child that just turned out to be entirely false. And these were like parents and grandparents and things that were passing on knowledge, but it turned out it was all BS. I used to get the little whites on the top of my nails pushed back up. It was incredibly painful. I get it done by my father every Sunday, and it was because this had to be required, or you would get your fingers would split. And it was entirely horseshit, but it's what his mother did to him, it's what he did to me, and it was just pain. But it was how he was taught. He thought he was doing a good thing. He didn't realise what he was doing was just inflicting pain for no sort of reasoning. But that was him trying to be his best person. You can't sort of hold that against the person. But then you've also got the investment that they would have in you. So, for instance, family and friends might have a lot of investment. Work colleagues, you could have some investment, or you could have somebody trying to exploit a weakness. So where you're talking about these things, how the support network works, is different. If it's like counsel or healthcare, you just might have somebody that's doing their job and just doesn't care. And sometimes that comes across. Sometimes you have somebody that's just doing a job but is very good at that job. So always keep out an eye for these things. So now that I've sort of spoken about the support networks, the doctors, the things around about it, I just want to quickly go through a few things at a little bit of a deeper sort of level so that you can understand some of this stuff if you don't. Because we're all different, we've all sort of missed a little bit of knowledge. That's it, no human knows everything, and we all have little bits. And by the way, as I'm talking about this, if you want to put your stuff down in the comments, feel free. I am more than happy to see agreements, disagreements, criticisms, your own views and stuff like this. What I will say is that if anybody is being aggressive to somebody else, regardless of how much they disagree with them, I will completely delete that on this particular video, because I've got no time for somebody going through a mental health thing and then somebody else shouting at them saying you're being an idiot and stuff like that, because that helps nobody. Constructive criticism is one thing, just being nasty, no, that's not for it. I don't mind that in gaming, but this is something else. So, as we're going back to it, ADHD usually comes up as for inattentiveness. You have having a short attention span or being easily distracted, making careless mistakes that are something you are very good at, but you just happen to make small mistakes. Appearing forgetful or losing things, being unable to stick to tasks that are tedious or time consuming, appearing unable to listen or carry out instructions, constantly changing activity or tasks, or having difficulty organising tasks. And then for hyperactivity, you have being able to sit still as one of the sort of things that they talk about. This comes into a thing called stimming, where you're constantly like bouncing a leg or pacing backwards and forwards or fidgeting and stuff like this. It is your brain sort of seeking dopamine and trying to create it when you're doing something that's boring. Being unable to concentrate on tasks, excessive physical movement, excessive talking, being unable to wait your turn when talking, so talking over the top of other people. That was one that was particularly bad for me until somebody smacked it out of me. Acting without thinking, interrupting conversations, and little or no sense of danger. Now that is what they talk about for the hyperactivity things, but I have some differences on that, because for instance, the little or no sense of danger comes into being hyper aware. So if you have hyperactive ADHD, you'll find that they're usually scanning their environment. If they're in a dangerous environment, then they sort of take in a lot more. I definitely do. And they'll pick up things that are a danger a lot faster than the neurotypical person. But at the same time, if they're in an environment where they feel safe, they just won't care. And that sense of danger, this is something people have commented about me many times, where I haven't reacted when people think that I should have, but at the same time, when something has gone wrong, it hasn't harmed me, it hasn't harmed anybody else, and I've seen it, and they're going, well, you weren't scared of it. It's like, it's not that I didn't have a sense of danger, it's that I knew what the consequences were, and they were not immediately threatening, so I concentrated on something else. I had this not too long ago with a gas tank that blew open at work, where I knew where the hinge was, I knew there was a risk of this happening, but I also knew the machinery, I knew the hinge was strong enough, I knew the door wouldn't sort of fly off or anything like this, and I knew I was clear. I was only clear by about half a foot, but when the door blew open, it sort of swung open 180, smacked into the thing, and that's where I sort of stepped to the side, and people were like, you should have gotten clear of that, and I was like, if I had tried to get clear, I would have actually moved into the path of danger with what was coming through the door. So there was a situation where I was aware of everything, and people sort of went, no, that was really dangerous, and I'm sat there disagreeing, going, no, this was actually safer for me to stay there. If I had ran, I'd be in trouble. So it's, for me, that little or no sense of danger, you can go all the way back through my childhood where you're sort of going, no, actually that is, it's like hyper aware of not just the danger but how risky it is and what the consequences could be. I also had this at one point where I was driving, I was going way too fast, I was doing like 3 times the speed limit in a low area. I was coming down this road, there was a junction on the left, car waiting to pull out and a car straight ahead, and at the last moment the car straight ahead pulled into the junction, and they had been waiting there, and I personally think this was somebody going, that person's going too fast, my car's kind of crap, if they hit me I will get compensation in a new car and stuff like this, because there was no other way that somebody would have pulled in at that junction when they had been waiting there for so long. But at the exact same second that they did this, I saw them doing it, and I had an escape plan ready. So as they swung the car in, I swung to the right and went all the way around them, mounted the pavement where there was nobody, shot past them and popped back onto the road. I had 3 other people in the car. I should not have been doing that speed, and I should not have been doing that speed with those people in the car. I was being an idiot in that sense. But everybody was sort of focused on how the hell did I see that happen at the last second. And it's because whenever I see a car, I assume that they're going to do something stupid. So I'm always counting for that. And so when things have gone wrong that way, especially riding a motorcycle first before I drove a normal car, that's something where my planning just sort of snapped in, because my brain is always sort of overthinking those things, and it just sort of went, plan A, off to the side. So that's something where I think the danger sense is a little off, but again it might come back to a lack of research, a lack of talking about these things. One of the things to do with ADHD and research is a lot of the research you'll find they have included people with manic depressive order, so bipolar disorder, in the same studies. The problem is that ADHD reacts differently mentally, chemically to things, so stimulants have a different effect on people with ADHD. They calm us down, they make us sleepy, so too much coffee puts you to sleep as opposed to wake you up. It can stop you sleeping properly, it can cause all other issues, there's a whole nother conversation about that, but stimulants that would have a normal person shaking like a shitting dog, for somebody that's got ADHD, they will actually calm you down and sort of bring you down a level. And that's why you will see a lot of people that are like high class sort of businessy people, accounting people, corporate mergers and stuff like this, that are actually cocaine fiends, and will say, I use it because it clears my head, it calms me down. It's because they're ADHD and they don't realise that they are getting a sedative instead of a stimulant, because of the reaction that cocaine has in their system. The problem with that for illegal substances is the fact that A, it's not regulated, B, it has worse effects on your heart and things like this. So you could have to get high on cocaine for somebody with ADHD, you'd be pushing the boundaries of what could cause you to have a heart attack because of sort of what's going on. So it's particularly dangerous. That's also why a lot of substances, illegal substances, can be an issue, because they react differently to us. But also why you might get a lot more addiction, which they have noticed in some places, because substances are not reacting the same way as you would expect, so you take a bit more, so the addiction effects can be amplified. That, again, that's just my thoughts on it. It hasn't been studied, and I've been through so many studies about this stuff. So from there we sort of go into the bipolar disorder, which is the misdiagnosed one. So bipolar disorder sort of falls into 4 types roughly, and they kind of go by the amount of times that you've had them. So for bipolar 1, it's you've had at least one manic episode, sort of almost right after a depressive episode, and occasionally you will have mania, which they sort of class as a break from reality. So not quite a mental break, but your head isn't quite located on the planet. It's just the best way I sort of think of it. But then bipolar 2 is you've had the depressive and the manic episode, so manic being really happy, stupidly happy for no reason, as opposed to stupidly depressed for no reason. But you've never had, hypomanic, so which is the depressive episodes, but you've never gone stupidly manic. So it's like the difference in the happiness to the depressive ratio, but again, there's no cause behind them. Then there's a couple of others that I don't really understand, cyclothymia and some other related ones. Essentially, it's you've had these episodes, but they aren't all the time. They are sort of happening less with cyclothymia, and then I think it's within 2-year period, I'm not entirely sure. And then there's other ones which are what they call bipolar related disorders, where it's basically been caused by drugs or alcohol, because obviously they mess with your brain chemistry and it can throw you this way. And one of the problems with this is sometimes, as you're describing it, especially for people with other issues going on, is you might get diagnosed because you can't think of what caused your depression or your mania. Or a good example from where I used to work is, we used to have a problem during the summers where people would be working 12 hours a day with no days off for like over a month. And you would get to this stage beyond tiredness where you got manic, where you got hyperactively hyper and excited and stuff like this. And we all recognise this, we all used to joke about this, because you get thrown into this weird sort of sensory thing because you've not been having enough sleep, you've still been having your 6 to 8 hours partying or different activities, going out climbing and all this jazz, but you've only had 2 hours sleep and you've been working 12 hours a day, and it's a very upbeat and hyperactive job, so you're basically running on caffeine and psychosis. And that is something that is essentially a side effect of sleep deprivation because of the job and things like this. It's not bipolar disorder, but some people might recognise that, or a doctor might say, oh, that's definitely bipolar disorder, without realising that it's the situation as opposed to the mental health. So bipolar disorder, while it is its own thing and it is very important, it's also misdiagnosed an awful lot because people don't, especially doctors, don't sort of listen to the other side or don't ask further questions. So it's something to be very aware of. I know several people that have been misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder that later turned out to be later turned out to be ADHD, and somebody who was actually autistic that was diagnosed as bipolar, and it was their episodes, as they were called, it was because somebody was setting them off, and it was an autistic reaction to overstimulation. So this is something that we should all be aware of, because these things can cause severe issues. And this also comes in with depression and anxiety, as I spoke about. Depression is sort of your bad mood, your downward spirals, and it's usually sort of the difference between it being a disorder and general sort of just being depressed is the situation behind it. Are you overreacting to the situation? And if you are, there may be something else at play. It's one of those things that it's something to be aware of, but it's also something to look at in relation to other things. Because, for instance, if you're ADHD, as I've sort of mentioned in the channel before, people with ADHD have very different reactions to certain drugs, and SSRIs are something that are problematic. It has not been fully studied. There's only a couple of links in particular studies that note, oh well, people with ADHD have a higher instance of suicides when starting on SSRIs, but actually everybody has a higher instance of suicide when starting these drugs. And then some doctors, there's a couple in the news at the moment that are going, SSRIs don't actually work for pretty much anybody, and we're psychologists. So that's all, nobody quite knows what's going on. There is some sort of fuckery there, so be aware of it. Try it, do what your doctor's telling you, I'm not saying that, but be aware of that reaction, because for me, when they put me on SSRIs, it wasn't actually for depression, it was for getting to sleep. So I thought it was just a sleeping tablet. I popped a sleeping tablet the next morning, I'm suicidal, and I'm sat there going, what the hell is going on? And that happened once a couple of weeks later. I didn't think much of it, it sort of went away after a day. So I popped one of these tablets again, and this was when I was having a particularly good time. A lot of things were going right. In fact, it's not too long from the stuff on the screen where everything was going really great, and all of a sudden I'm suicidal for no reason. And I'm like, what's going on? Oh, I took that pill last night. What the hell are those sleeping pills? Oh, they're SSRIs. Oh, they are the thing that I refused to take when the doctor for ADHD had sort of said to them, because I was scared of the reaction, and oh my god, did I get a reaction off of them. So they pulled me off of them, and immediately I was like, oh no, you shouldn't be touching this is particularly bad. So always something to keep an eye of, especially if you have a mood change like that while on medication. Pay attention to the medication. And sort of general anxiety and things like this, keep an eye on that, because it could be an anxiety disorder, but at the same time it could be an accurate sort of reaction to something. Maybe you're in a workplace with a bully, or you are in in a family situation where somebody's trying to pressure you into things and stuff like this. Not always like abuse or anything like this. Maybe it's just I'd like you to go and do such and such, and you don't want to for whatever reason. It could cause sort of low level, never mind high level anxiety. So these things are good to look at. And then we have the whole PTSD, the fun reaction to trauma, and then the complex PTSD, which is essentially you've had PTSD, the situation's not gone away, it's lasted for a couple of years, and now you've got brain damage, which is making it even worse, and you're fixated on revenge and a whole load of things. And then on top of this, physical symptoms. I'm not just talking about headaches and stuff like this. I personally get pains in my chest, my left arm and my right leg. Severe pains that for years I didn't know was a stress reaction. It's technically synesthesia, I can't even pronounce it right. But essentially I thought it was a sore leg, and it was so bad that I would actually collapse when getting out of vehicles. So if I got down off of the tractor, my knee would just go out for me, I'd hit the floor hard. But there was nothing wrong there. They did x-rays, MRIs, contrast CT scans, you name it. I was in a spinal thing, I was in it, all sorts of different specialists. For years they couldn't figure out what the hell it was, and eventually they gave me a painkiller which was psychoactive, and it was actually the second one, because the first one they gave me was morphine, but morphine, I had escalated to the morphine, but morphine didn't do anything because I'm ginger and I'm resistant to morphine. Both the psychoactive effects and the painkilling effects. Paracetamol works better for me than morphine because gingers be funny. But then they gave me something else that was psychoactive, and it started helping with the pain. Then a little while later the pain went away and I didn't have to take the drugs. The pain went away coincidentally with the same boss who had been bullying me for quite a severe time and had been threatening me daily, and I didn't recognise any of that until almost a decade later, when I was going through another situation, and I was like, I've got this pain in my leg again. And we were going through the history of it, and I was having these chest pains and stuff like this. There was nothing wrong with my heart. My internal organs are far healthier than anybody would expect and all this jazz. And then somebody went, that pain, when was the last time that you had it? Describe what was happening at the time, not just the physical pain, but what was happening in your life. And realised that I get physical reaction to emotional stress, because that's fun. So those are some general things that I just sort of wanted to put that information out there. I know this has run a bit long, but in general I thought this might be helpful for somebody. It might be something of interest, and if it helps one person, then it's worth it, because a lot of this stuff I didn't know, and this took over technically 30 years to sort of learn all of this, even when it was myself and I was being helped with professionals. Some of this stuff was only recently sort of come to light, and I didn't know it from. I didn't realise that some of it had happened in the past and stuff like this. And when I was talking to somebody today, seeing that they had had the exact same problem with the doctor, not the same doctor, but the same situation where the doctor was basically telling them something that they knew to be far behind the current knowledge base. But it's because we live in the same area and our doctors around about here are not particularly good. Unfortunately, we live in a town that's sort of declining and dying. And people don't want to work here. There's a massive shortage, and the people that are here are the ones who can't get a well-paid job somewhere else. So that's what we're sort of stuck with. So I thought I'd put that information out there. If this has been interesting, then if you've managed, leave a comment if you've managed to get through this far, because I'm not going to cut any of this out, and I'm well aware we're over 50 minutes now. But I just thought this might be something important for somebody who likes listening to random people talk while they're gaming or something like that. Might put this on as well, and you get to see some gaming and some forestry stuff, because it's always funny to see a weird life. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching, bye.